Hey, it's your 3D CG guru, Nathaniel Albright, and in this video series, we're going to take a look at the new AI interpolation option that has been embedded into the timeline inside of Cascadeur. Super crazy stuff. I've just been playing with it for a little bit today, and I wanted to record a video about it. So what we're going to do is we're going to recreate this animation here. Essentially, we're going to create a stand to run and then run to stand, but we're also going to create a nice loopable run cycle in the middle here. So right in this section from essentially 53 to 74, I'll show you a quick, easy way to make sure that this section can be extracted out for your game for a nice run cycle in the middle of everything. So let's get into it. Before we can actually get into this animation here, we need to talk about the rig and some of the changes that have happened in the latest version. So I have this Viking character here. I believe I got it from Miximo a while ago, and it was rigged in a version prior to 2025.3. And to properly get the AI system to animate this lower body for me, which is essentially what I want it to do, we do want to make a modification here. We essentially want to regenerate the rig for this character. And the reason for that is essentially right now, the entire body is on one track, but we want to have the pelvis separated from the torso so that AI can generate motions of the lower body while I'm in control of the upper body. So I'm going to quickly go into rig mode, open up the quick rig tool, and just regenerate our rig here. Of course, after the rig generation is done, you might want to take a moment just to kind of adjust the length of some of these additional points here. I like to kind of pull my points out to be closer to the edge of the body, like so. And we could even take these shoulder points and maybe pull those up a little bit. All right. This is also a time where you could adjust the fingertips to kind of make sure they're actually hitting the ends of your fingers. But for us, we'll say that's good enough. I'm going to go ahead and undo those since the right hand doesn't have the matching offsets. And we'll go ahead and just generate. All right, now that that's done, we can look over here at the tracks. And what actually happened was when I regenerated this, it rebuilt the layers. And the old layers actually left behind for the body. And the reason for that is I had added a custom object into that track, and the Quick Rig tool doesn't know what it should do with that in that particular situation. I happen to know that that's just a single little group object here. So I'm going to just move that over to the torso and go over there. And once that's moved, I should be able to select this track and delete it there. All right, so now you'll see we have the addition of the pelvis track. Now, one other thing I would like to change about the track assignment right now is that by default, the torso is going to include the points here and here. And ultimately, I'm going to probably wind up having AI generate the torso motion for me, and I'm just going to be in control of the arms and the posing of the arms. And for that, I want that to include the posing of the shoulders. The character that I have, essentially, we're going to start an animation from this pose. And we've got kind of some sloped shoulders. I intentionally kind of lowered the shoulders down here a little bit. But if AI is responsible for the shoulders, you're going to find they're going to lift up and they're not going to match the posing I did in my shoulders. So I want to move these points here into the arms tracks. And all I really care about here is I don't actually want the main shoulder point added to the arms. That's going to stay in the torso, but I want the point that's in charge of the twist of the shoulder to be added to the arms. And I want the point that's responsible for the main direction of the shoulder to be added to the arm track. So I'll grab these two and I will select my left arm here and let's expand that and then actually grab the left arm track and I will say move those points to that track and I'll grab these and I'll do the same over here. I'll just move those over. So now if I hold down Alt and double click on arm, I should see a selection that looks like this. Everything looks right. Same over here. Okay, so now our character is in a better position to actually be able to pose it and be in control of the parts I want to be in control and let AI do the in-betweening for the parts that I want it to do. All right, now that our character is ready to pose, I've already gone in and just kind of posed myself a kind of generic looking stance here. And just as a reminder, one nice thing to do inside of Cascadeur is just, turn on the silhouette mode, take a look at how readable your particular pose is for a given character. Is it capturing what you're looking for? Now, you can really see in the silhouette mode how bad the wrist looks in this particular case, but there's not a whole lot I can do about that because this particular skeleton didn't come with any twist bones, and I definitely want to hold my axe with my hand like this. So I'm just going to have this kind of messed up wrist there, and that's just what we're going to wind up living with. Now, before we get to animating, I do want to constrain this hand to this weapon, and to make sure I'm actually constraining the entire transform, position and rotation of the hand, I need to grab all 3 points that make that hand up, and then I can just select any point that represents the control for the weapon itself. I'll go to constraints, constrain, and I'll enable point constraint. When I do this, I'll say that I want the weapon to be responsible for driving this particular constraint. Now that I've added a constraint, I need to go to the constraint behavior and turn it on for the actual keyframe I'm on. Now, they did actually make an improvement to the constraints in this version of Cascadeur. Watch here, if I grab this and I start to pull this and the arm can't actually reach the weapon, it will start to drag the left arm. And that's different than in the previous versions of Cascadeur here. So here's one version earlier. As I pull this, the left arm doesn't actually get pulled by the constraint system and gets kind of left behind. So that's a nice little addition that they have to this version of Cascadeur. All right. So now that we've done this, I'm going to go ahead and just save as a new version, and we'll start creating some animation data. The goal here is I want to create a stand to run, a running loop, and then a run to stand. So I'm going to take my stand pose and I'll just shift middle click drag to give me a copy of that pose. Then I'll grab the center mass, which is a nice kind of move all mode, and just move this character forward in space. So now we get essentially something like this. Okay, I should mention real quick, just as a reminder, when we're setting these constraints or setting properties for anything here, you really have data for the current frame as well as the interval frame. So we can have the constraint enabled just for the keyframe data, and we can have it off for the interpolation. In this particular case, everything's working as expected because we can see my constraint is on. But if you're ever in a situation where you notice the constraint is not working, it's because you forgot to turn it on for your actual interval. All right, so this is my animation, and let's go in there and we're going to start to refine this. I'm going to grab everything here and just turn on a Bezier interpolation, so Alt B, and we now get this. Next, what I want to do is I want to select those sections of my body that I want it to generate motions for me. So I'll select the legs and the pelvis, and I'll say create in-betweening, and this is what we get. Now, at this point, you're going to see some non-ideal behavior here. The hands themselves, because they're interpolating through IK, they're just translating from one position to another, and they're leaving the body behind a bit. So right here is probably the most extreme, and then the body kind of catches up to the arms, which is exactly what I don't want. So I'm going to take my arms, and I'll go ahead and just set those to FK, and that'll give me something like this. Now, I will take a moment to mention that with constraints, you will find that you want to have your constraints set to IK for interpolation. If you don't, technically the points can kind of stretch and change your bone lengths to make sure that constraint is actually achieved, which I don't want in this particular case. All right, so I have this. And another thing I always do for constraints is I always turn my interpolation type to linear. And the reason for that is what's interesting about constraints inside of Cascadeur is that the constraints just make sure the points are where they need to be during the keyframes, but interpolation can cause them to drift and sway. So it's pretty interesting, and it can actually be a nice feature, but it can be confusing when you come from Maya, and when a constraint is active, it's always active. But in Cascadeur, it's like positions of the objects are solved through the world, and then interpolation is calculated as a second step. So if I want to make sure that everything is just moving smoothly and I don't have any type of momentum being added to the hand on top of the constraint, I want to set this to linear. You could set it to stepped, but the issue there is, let's say I'm here on frame 0, and then I go to my last frame and I move my hand here. The problem with stepped is we would just see a 1-frame pop, where if I have this set to linear, I'll get a nice slow transition over that period of time, and I won't get that pop actually being applied. So I'm going to go ahead and just undo that move that I did here. All right, so I always take my points and set them to IK interpolation linear. Now, in this particular case, I have the lower body doing some animation, but the upper body is really, really stiff right now. And I think I'm actually going to go ahead and enable interpolation for my torso as well, so that I can get a lot of nice weight shift and transfer as you'd expect to see in some type of walk. So we get something like this. From this point, we can start to kind of play around with the timing of the animation itself, which will impact the generated data. And you can think about this in two different ways in which you can modify this end pose. One would be I can change how far it travels in that time. So we can modify the distance and that will produce a different animation here, right? So now he's going from more of a jog to a walk. And the other thing we can obviously do is we can kind of do the opposite. We could stretch the amount of time it takes to get to a spot. And that will also produce something a little bit different here. In my particular case, I think I want to kind of modify both. So I want to give this a good period of time so my character can get up to a full run, possibly do a couple cycles of a full run, and then slow down. Let's go ahead and start maybe, let's see like what 110 frames looks like. And then the other thing I need to do and take into consideration then obviously is how far does he travel in that time? So we could pull out something like this and let's just see how this is looking. All right, so that is looking pretty good. Now, I might actually even make him go a little bit further. I think I want him looking like he's going a little faster here. So let's try something like this. All right, so that's going to be the animation we're working with. I'm going to go ahead and increment and save, and we'll carry right along. The next thing I want to do is I want to try to identify a good section of this animation where I can convert that into a nice clean cycle. And you really just have to kind of study the motion as a whole. And I think the easy way to do that is to enable ghosts, and we'll turn on ghosts for all of our keys. And I'm going to go in here and just start at the beginning and then left click and drag to select over time. And what I'm really looking at this point is what is the height that this character's head is getting to within the chart. And then you could start to see a slowdown here at the end. So when I look at this, probably, somewhere in this area to this area would be a good place for a cycle. So we're kind of looking at maybe frame 80 all the way back to somewhere in, let's say, 59. Now, the one thing I've noticed from the little bit that I've done with this generative AI stuff is that as you set keys, because everything regenerates, the data is going to keep shifting. And at this point, I don't want anything to shift. I just kind of want to freeze the AI generated data to work with it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab these tracks that are AI generated and just set those over to fixed for now to make sure nothing kind of changes on me. And let's go back again and just kind of look at this time range one more time. So I don't think I'm going to use the last part here because he definitely could be kind of shifting the angle of his torso in preparation to slow down. And so let's say we're going to do something. I'm going to maybe try to pick a point where the foot is about to touch the ground. So I'm going to go to the top right and enable the ability to kind of see the fulcrum points and what their activation is for any given point. So this is the last frame where this character is touching the ground before he goes into a kind of a ballistics trajectory. And then here's a plant. So I could maybe choose this plant point here. Let's go back and see what this looks like here. So I think I'm going to do frame 53. I'll select the track and just hit the hotkey for setting a key, which is, I believe, F by default. I've remapped mine, so I don't quite remember anymore. And then let's go right to here. And then I'll hit F again for, yeah, in my case, a different key. All right, so this should be my cycle. Now, when I look at these, obviously there's going to be shifts. You can see the body's really shifting quite a bit here. And not just the overall pose, but also the center of mass is probably not going to be exactly aligned between both of these as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go one frame earlier and preserve that key as well. So when I have two keys side by side, that is really kind of preserving the momentum and all that information in here. And what I really want to do is I just want to take this pose and copy it back over to here. The easiest way, I think the kind of hack way to do this is I'm going to go in here and select the center of mass and make sure trajectories are enabled. You can also right click on the center mass and say show trajectory if it's not shown. And then I'm going to lock that selection and then I'm going to hit the backspace key so that when I deselect here, it still shows that. Next, I'm going to grab these two keys here and I'll shift middle click drag over to there. And when I do this, I get a obvious gap in the pose of my character because he's jumped back in space. So now I just need to move him where he should belong in this area. So I will turn on interval edit mode with a stepped edit. I'll grab that center of mass, and then I'm just going to pull that character forward until the relative spacing for these two keys looks about right. So about there seems good to me. Doesn't have to be precise because we're going to regenerate the animation here in a second. But this gets me roughly in the right spot, I think. And then always remember to turn off interval edit mode when you're actually done doing that type of edit. All right, so now if I look at this from the front and I kind of adjust my timeline to, in this case, 53, and then over here, I guess actually we don't even need to deal with the timeline yet because it's not going to loop cleanly at this point, but I can jump from here to here and everything looks identical, which is what we're after. Okay, so now that I've done that, let's go back into the generative AI and let's just grab all this and have it regenerate our animation, making sure that these preserved poses are taken into consideration. All right, now let's just kind of confirm that everything looks the way we'd expect. So I'm gonna just trim down my timeline from here to here. The beginning of my cycle is technically going to be this second key here, not this first one. This is just going to be used for the generative AI going into the loop. And I want to keep this one because I want to make sure it goes into the last frame the way I expect. So we're going to go over to 53 here and let's turn off ghosts and just check this from the front. So now if we go in here, we hit play. This is my animation. It looks a little silly because the hands are probably a little too low and it's kind of clipping into his legs here, but we'll clean that up in a moment. So yeah, let's actually get to that cleanup right now. Essentially, I'm happy with the results of my torso, pelvis, and legs. So again, I'm gonna set that to fixed. Of course, if you wanted to maybe convert that over to general keyframe data so you could continue to refine the results of that, you could always use the unbake option here to do that. But at this case, I think it's gonna be just fine the way it is. And now I just kind of want to deal with these hands that are clipping. To do that, let's just find some frames like here when he's starting to take off, the arm is going into the leg or the weapon's going into the leg. So let's take our hands and just set a keyframe there. And then again, this is another spot where we're really kind of clipping. So I'm just going to add a couple points where I probably want to add some breakdowns. All of this, we're just going to adjust real quickly here. And let's see what happens if we just do this. I'm going to go ahead, select that time range of key data and turn on interval edit mode again. And this time I'm just going to grab this and kind of pull it up like so. And then we'll jump to the next frame using Shift D. And let's just focus on this, make sure the clipping's gone. And then let's go here from the front view and see how that looks. And that might be all we need to do. Let's just go ahead and hit play. Okay, so we saw a little bit of a hand shift. And the reason for that actually is because when I did the interval edit mode, I had baked this key data by mistake. And that's because I had a fixed interpolation on change interval enabled, which I don't want. So I'm going to turn that off. And then let's grab these keys here and just set that back to a default Bezier interpolation. So that is kind of the main goal achieved at this point. Nice, simple, fast, a great way to kind of prototype things. If you want to get these into game quickly, I could, maybe I want to play with the posing of this a little bit more during the center of his run. I will mention one thing, which is the constraints themselves are going to cause some issues if you go into physics and enable physics at this point and you have secondary motion enabled. I believe the reason for that is because in this particular case, I essentially have a cyclical loop has been my kind of assumption where essentially the hand wants to move as well as the weapon in the other hand, and it doesn't know how to solve for that. So in this case, I actually had to turn off secondary motion if I want to keep that constraint. Otherwise, I could delete the constraint through the delete command, and I could bake the hand animation first before I do that and then remove that constraint. So again, I could grab this, I could say fix interpolation, and then I could go in there and remove that constraint through the command constraint delete point constraints option. Then the secondary motion options are valid, but it doesn't really hold up because then the hands may actually move away from one another. So if I really want some secondary action for this particular animation, I would go in there and just animate that myself, just give myself some additional breakdowns and get the feel of that looking the way I'd expect. Actually, one final edit I want to make is related to this section where we're actually doing the looping animation. I don't like how far the weapon is out from his torso if we look at the left hand in particular. I think the right hand is okay, but I just don't like the way this is kind of hanging out. So I'm going to correct that real quick. I'll just, again, select the arm tracks and select that time range where we have the looping animation. And then I'll double click on my right hand here. Now, for this, I could really just do an interval edit stepped adjustment right here, but I do want to show you guys one other little thing I discovered more recent than not inside of Cascadeur, which is the ability for your rotation gizmo to match the orientation of other objects in your scene. So if I hold down Control Shift and right click on my weapon handle, it does change the orientation here to match that of the weapon. In this particular case, really probably doesn't matter. I could go back here and I'm sure I could make this adjustment like I want like this. But let's say I wanted to twist on the weapon itself. This is not really working well. But if I click on this, and actually in this case, I would set it around the actual weapon itself. But it's still a nice trick, and I've actually found it to be really beneficial in cases where I have some type of twist in my pelvis, let's say, and I want to swing this pelvis out. If I go in here and I set my pivot to the upper body, it's not really swinging in the direction of the orientation of my pelvis itself, but I could set this like this, and then I'm actually swinging out around there. So that's been the area where I've found that to be the most useful. But I thought I'd just mention it real quick as a little tip in this video. So let's just go in there and grab this and just kind of pull this back like so. And now let's just see what this looks like. We'll turn off that interval edit. So we get this. The other nice thing about that is I like the fact that as we're getting into the run, the weapon's lower and then it kind of comes up in time for the run itself. I think that looks nice. All right, so there we go. That is our quickly roughed out Viking axe stand to run, run, run to stand animation set. Hopefully you found this useful.